When expert scuba divers take on cave diving for the first time, their confidence and experience can work against them when catastrophe strikes. This is the fatal breakdown of the Jacob's Well diving tragedy. In November of 1983, Richard Patton and Clark McConnell were students at Texas State University in San Marcos. They were both fairly experienced divers who were trying to obtain their instructor's certifications in open water diving. Texas State offered an advanced diving course, taught by a master diving instructor named Don Dibble. Don was a rescue diver with Hays County, a former Navy diver, owned the local dive shop, and had decades of diving experience to qualify him as an instructor. Don knew the risks associated with scuba diving and instructed his classes with a reserved sense for safety. One of his most crucial instructions was to stay out of Jacob's Well. It was only 30 minutes away and somehow had lured many scuba divers to their deaths. It is an incredibly beautiful recreational area, with crystal clear waters revealing a deep hole in an otherwise shallow river. Many swimmers free dive into the hole and try to touch the bottom at 25 feet deep before pushing quickly back to the top. As far as blue holes go, this one seems to be quite simple on the surface. But that's not the reality of what lies beneath. The bottom at 25 feet is deceiving, because the corner of that well slips away in a gravel slope leading to a whole new underwater chamber. Explorations began once cave divers figured this out, and 3 different chambers were identified under the main well. The first 2 chambers were mostly open columns of water. The third chamber had a challenging squeeze to navigate inside. It was intimidating for most. But once through to the other side, a diver enters a room that is nearly 10 feet tall and has some trapped air in the narrow peak at the top. In the farthest edge of the third chamber, a tiny hole, not big enough to push through, was seen near the floor. Exactly what was beyond that hole was too tempting to ignore. Many divers tried to squeeze through the hole by pulling gravel and rocks away to make it large enough to pass. It was just 4 years before, in 1979, that Don had been asked to help recover the bodies of 2 men from Jacob's Well. Kent Maupin and Mark Brassier had entered the 4th chamber, but they did not make it back out. There was a gravel cave-in in the tight connecting tunnel. Divers had to squeeze their body through a tunnel that was just 2 feet in diameter. After the men had passed through the tunnel, a rock slide of gravel filled the narrow tube. They probably spent their last moments trying to clear the rocks and gravel, but ultimately ran out of time. The body recovery team was not able to clear the gravel landslide to get to Kent and Mark's bodies. Mark's body was washed out by current in 1981. Kent's body remained in the 4th chamber for the next 20 years. Don was sick about more lives being lost trying to access the elusive 4th chamber. In January 1980, he took cement and rebar down to cover the small hole. He blocked the passage, leaving bars in the middle to allow the water to continue to flow. It might seem like this would be the end of the story for the 4th chamber, but it wouldn't be that simple. Only months later, divers had pulled away the bars and cement, leaving a note on a plastic slate stating, "You can't keep us out." Don had done his best to help save people from themselves. Now he was just trying to instruct divers to stay away altogether. Unfortunately, Don's warnings may have sparked interest in 2 of his current students, Richard and Clark. They had heard about Don's body recovery missions, and even his own near-death experience in the 4th chamber. Don was trying to enter the 4th chamber when a gravel slide trapped him in the 2-foot narrow crawl space. His arms were pinned so he couldn't pull on the safety line or bang on his tank to get his team members' attention. After several minutes, he had almost resigned himself to death, knowing that he could not move and his air would be gone in just another minute or 2. He recounts an eerie sense of calmness at knowing that this was it. His tank was empty, and he'd even swallowed some water. It was in this moment that he had a burst of survival instinct. wild thrashing and kicking that cleared enough gravel for him to push backwards. He backed out of the tunnel and saw his diving partner there with his regulator extended for Don to breathe. Don gasped in the air wildly, swallowing some as he inhaled. The incredible fear had eased into relief at just being alive, but that relief was short-lived. As he started moving back up through the chambers, the pain of the expanding air in his stomach became debilitating. His diving partner's air supply was now almost gone, so they had to keep moving up to get out of the water. Air is compressed under 58 psi or 4 atmospheres of pressure at a depth of 100 feet. As he moved up, the air in his body expanded 4 times the volume. It was at the bottom by the time Don reached the surface. He looked as if he were 9 months pregnant. He was screaming out in pain because his stomach had completely ruptured. Don recounted these desperate moments of his life in order to warn the students how even the most experienced diver can be surprised by deadly changes inside underwater caves. Despite the warning, Richard and Clark thought it sounded like quite an adventure to take a look at this forbidden cave. The problem with this trip was that these experienced divers weren't just going diving. They were going cave diving. These are 2 separate activities, with additional rules and risks. The confidence and problem-solving that may come with experience in diving might not help at all in a cave situation. They didn't know to bring a safety line to clearly mark the path. They also weren't experienced in frog kicking to keep silt from being disturbed along the walls and bottom of a cave. The most important difference is that just going up won't bring you closer to safety. Disoriented open-water divers can just follow the bubbles to the surface. Cave divers cannot. It was the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving when Richard and Clark entered Jacob's Well. At 8:30, they made their way through the main well and first chambers without issue. As they moved to enter the 3rd chamber, it became clear that this was where the dangerous part began. Once your body is squeezed through the tight junction, the risk is on another level. There will be no quick swim to the top if there is a problem with your equipment. You are trapped in a tight environment that will require a slow and methodical exit. The 2 men were both anxious, but excited about the next part of exploration. They came to the small hole that leads to the 4th chamber. Richard and Clark approached the hole and started to remove their tanks. It would require them to push the tanks through separately, while squeezing their bodies through the tiny passage. Richard pushed himself through the tunnel, while Clark looked on. Clark waited a few moments to allow him to pass through the tunnel, then started to remove his own tank. He moved towards the opening when the face of his friend pushed through with a frantic expression of anguish. Richard came through the hole with a wild force, raking his body against the rocks. Suddenly, Clark realized what was wrong. Richard had no air tank. He was suffocating. He grabbed his own regulator and jammed it into Richard's mouth so he could breathe. After a moment, they started buddy breathing, passing the regulator back and forth while they made their way out of the cave. This took an incredible amount of patience, calm, and trust. To squeeze back through the passage between chambers 2 and 3 would take the most delicate coordination in a desperate struggle for breath. Each man would take a turn, breathing from the regulator, then hold his breath and pass the mouthpiece over to the other. They would have to do this while moving through a tight squeeze and figuring out where to go next, all without stirring up too much silt. It was an incredible challenge, and they were doing it. Richard and Clark entered the 1st chamber with some measure of relief that they were close. It was dark outside, so there was no sunbeam to guide the way to the surface of the main well. Maps and descriptions of tunnels are deceiving. These passages aren't straight and smooth pathways through the caves. They are actually jagged and irregular, difficult to maneuver, and it's easy to become disoriented. They were moving slowly because of the shared air tank, but making their way up the wall to the exit of this chamber. As they pushed on, an unreal sound stopped them in their tracks. The tank in front of them made a hollow clank, which not only indicated that it was basically empty, but that somehow they had hit a ceiling. They moved to the left and right, feeling the ceiling above as the walls came down around them. This devastating realization induced a panic that cannot be measured. The men were trapped, and they had just taken their last breath of air. Clark had just taken a long draw of breath and knew the tank was empty. Richard was wide-eyed already on a breath hold, and feeling his way around the ceiling trying to find an opening, they were in trouble. Clark instantly realized that this was the false chimney in the first chamber. A false chimney is essentially a tunnel inside of a cave that appears to lead to the surface, but is actually nothing but a dead end. In a fit of desperation, he pushed off the wall back the way they came for 20 feet and entered the first chamber again. It was nearly 25 feet to the top of this chamber, and then up through to the main well for another 25 feet to the surface. Clark pierced the surface of the water and made a desperate gasp for air after swimming a frantic 75 feet on a single breath hold. He was relieved to actually be alive. It was a miracle. The elation gave way to complete terror for his friend Richard. He was still in the water, and time had run out. He knew that Richard was dead. He waited a few moments to see if he might somehow surface, then called the police to request assistance. Don had gotten the call for diver rescue and was at Jacob's Well within an hour. When he arrived, he was stunned to find out that it was 2 of his students who were involved in the incident. They were expert divers, but cave diving was something else altogether. The lower chambers were silted out, so they waited until morning to recover Richard's body. It was clear that there was nowhere for him to go in the false chimney, and Clark described exactly where he could be found. Sadly, Don helped recover Richard's body the next day. Despite his continued warnings, and even creating a physical barrier to the 4th chamber, another life was lost in Jacob's Well. Just a year later, Wayne Russell would die in the 4th chamber while diving with friends. Don was there to recover his body as well. Eventually, Don's goal of restricting the chambers was realized. The Hays County Parks Department authorized a single group to explore Jacob's Well past the 40-foot depth mark. The Jacob's Well Exploration Project has done extensive exploration of the thousands of feet of passages in this cave system. A new grate has been placed at the 40-foot mark, and all recreational scuba diving is prohibited. It is estimated that at least 8, and possibly as many as 12 people have lost their lives scuba diving in Jacob's Well.